Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue with Chapter 19, the last chapter of the course, the Pacific War, 1943 to 45. We're going to do Part 2, Iwo Jima. Last week we did Part 1, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where we saw the Japanese Navy pretty much get reduced to a very small force. No more air attacks. They lost most of their carrier planes. So now we're going to be taking this to the next step, which will be the invasion of the Philippines. And then finally, this section will be the invasion then of the island of Iwo Jima. Now, after capturing Saipan in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the United States looks to retake Guam. Guam was an American territory before the war and was invaded and captured by the Japanese shortly after Pearl Harbor. We covered this earlier. During the occupation, the Guamanians, and they are the inhabitants of Guam are referred to as Guamanians, were subjected to terrible atrocities by the Japanese: beheadings, forced labor, rape, torture, murders. So it was a brutal time for them. On July 21st, 1944, the U.S. invades Guam and retakes the island in just 3 weeks. Here we see the map, and you can see right in the center there is the Marianas where Saipan is, and they move right over to invade Guam, which wasn't far away. So they completed the takeover by August 10th. Here we see a picture. It's the Marines. They were thanking the Coast Guard. The United States Coast Guard was involved. There was their ships that helped bring them, many of the Marines to Guam. Now, this allowed more airfields to be built for B-29s to attack Japan. They were building them on Saipan. They're going to build more on Guam. Now, it was a heavy fighting. The United States lost 3,000 killed. Japan loses 18,000 men. Of their defenses there, only 500 surrendered. In January, this is an interesting story, in January of 1972, a Japanese Army Sergeant, Tsuyoshi Yokoi, was discovered on Guam. Having lived alone in a cave for 28 years, he still thought the war was going on. He was finally discovered by some hunters on the island after 28 years. Now, Liberation Day commemorates the victory. They still celebrate this on Guam on the day the Americans landed on the island, July 21st. Guam is still an American territory today. This is their flag. The over 162,000 inhabitants of Guam, the Guamanians, are American citizens by birth, and they do vote in U.S. primary elections. Now we're going to talk about the air war over Japan. Now that the United States is building airfields on Saipan and Guam, they were able to bring in their new B-29 bombers, and they're going to start attacking Japan. Now the B-29 started bombing raids over Japan with their new bases in Saipan and Guam. There were more B-29 raids over Japan. On November 24th, 1944, 111 B-29s from Saipan hit Tokyo. These were more intense raids. There were mostly a lot of fire bombings. A lot of the Japanese cities had wooden buildings. So they regularly launched these firebombing raids until really pretty much to the end of the war. Here we see the B-29s flying past the iconic Mount Fuji in Japan, and then dropping their bombs over Tokyo. Now, United States Army Air Force general in charge of the bombings, Curtis LeMay, wanted to destroy Japanese cities with fire, so that's why he insisted on the firebombing. The attacks succeeded in devastating the top 60 large Japanese cities and severely damaged Japan's war industries. On March 9, 10th, 1945, 334 B-29s bombed Tokyo, causing a major firestorm. It destroyed 267,000 buildings and killed 80,000 people. Here we see some of the photographs of what Tokyo looked like after the firestorm. Now, in September of 1944, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, their combined chiefs of staff met in Quebec City to decide what to do about Japan. They came up with two plans. The first was the Army plan, a full-scale invasion of Japan, or two was the Navy plan. Since Japan was near defeat, they wanted just to blockade it and then bomb it into submission until they surrendered. They did not make a final decision at Quebec. Now, Admiral Nimitz wanted to blockade the Philippines and invade the island of Formosa, currently the country of Taiwan. MacArthur, on the other hand, wanted an invasion of the Philippines. He wanted to fulfill that promise he made, the famous vow to, return, I shall return. Here we see to show you here on the map, the two plans here. This was Nimitz's plan, Formosa, as you can see here. Just to give you an idea, remember, Japan is up here. So he wants to keep that moving toward Formosa. But MacArthur, on the other hand, he wanted to attack the Philippines, which, as you can see, the arrow just disappeared, but is further away. All right, let's get this out of here. We'll move on. FDR had to come in and decide the dispute, and in the end, he sided with MacArthur. MacArthur had a lot of pull. No idea why. Now, the Philippines is very strongly garrisoned by the Japanese. They have over 250,000 soldiers, 270,000 soldiers in the Philippines. Now, they expected an invasion on the main island of Luzon, where Manila is. The United States instead is going to attack on the smaller island of Leyte, which is further south, and it had only 16,000 men. So this would be easier to show you here on the map. Luzon here is up in the north, very heavily defended. But they're going to attack instead down here at Leyte, which is lighter defended, and then move their way up toward Luzon. So that's the goal the United States has. Now, there's a 2-day pre-invasion air raid against the Philippines. They destroy 40 Japanese ships and shoot down about 500 Japanese planes. So finally, on October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur invades the Philippines. General Walter Kruger's U.S. 6th Army lands on the island of Leyte. MacArthur then later comes ashore and he gives his famous speech, "I have returned." Here we see MacArthur coming ashore. This was a very famous photograph for him. He actually did it a few times to make sure he got it right, or it looked right. Now, the Japanese are not going to give up on the Philippines very easily. And they're going to send their Navy down there, this is the second time, like they did in Saipan. They're going to send the Navy down there to try to, what was left of the Navy, to try to destroy the American invasion. Now, you remember, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese really have no airplanes left on their carrier. So the carriers are basically just ships with flat decks. They really don't have anything they can fly off of. So they're going to mainly depend on their battleships and their cruisers and their destroyers to attack the American fleet. The American landings. The American fleet still has a lot of aircraft carriers and a lot of planes. So this is going to be very difficult for the Japanese. All right, so the goal is to repel or destroy the Allied invasion of Leyte. And this will lead to the largest naval battle in history, with more ships involved. It's also the last sea battle of the war. And it's also the first battle where the Japanese will intentionally use a kamikaze or suicide aircraft. They've always had in the past when planes would be like damaged and the pilot would, instead of bailing out, or he would try to crash into a ship. But this is now the first time you're going to see planes taking off to go on one-way missions where their actual goal is to fly into American ships. The actual idea of committing suicide before they even, take off. There's a whole ritual for it and everything. Here we see a kamikaze plane coming down toward an American aircraft carrier. Now, the Japanese plan was to lure the U.S. Third Fleet, this was Admiral Halsey's fleet, away from the Philippine Islands with a decoy of aircraft carriers. As I mentioned, they were useless because there was a lack of planes, but by doing this, he would then, by luring his planes away, he would then put the Philippine invasion force without, or at least what they thought it would be, without air cover. They never realized how many aircraft carriers we actually had. Then they're going to attack the U.S. landing beaches with two other fleets of surface ships, mostly cruisers and battleships. Now, the Japanese are going to divide their Navy force into three forces: the Northern, the Center, and the Southern force. There are four actual separate engagements on October 24th and the 25th of 1944. Now, Halsey takes the bait. The U.S. Third Fleet chases the Japanese Northern force, the carrier fleet, north of the Philippines, north of Luzon, in what becomes known as the Battle of Cape Engano. Now, Halsey will sink 4 Japanese carriers with air attacks. That includes the Zukaku. This was the last of the 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Here we see a photograph. They were saluting the flag as the flag was coming down. As you can see, the ship is starting to capsize to one side. Now, because Halsey has sailed the main U.S. fleet away from the Philippines, he's left the invasion fleet vulnerable to a Japanese attack. Now, the Center Force, this was the main Japanese battleship fleet. They head to Leyte. Admiral Kurita has 5 battleships, including the 2 largest battleships in the world, the Yamato and its sister ship, the Musashi. Now, the U.S. carrier planes sink the Musashi. It took 17 bombs and 20 torpedoes to do it, but they did eventually sink it. Now, with the U.S. Third Fleet heading north, only the smaller 7th Fleet was left to protect the landing areas. This will be known as the Battle off Samar. Now, as the Japanese get close to the Leyte beaches, Americans desperately attack them and drive them back. U.S. destroyers and relentless air attacks force Kurita's fleet to retreat. 3 more battleships are severely damaged. Only the Yamato is combat worthy. Here we see the Japanese kamikaze attack sink the U.S. carrier St. Lo. This was the first ship sunk by a kamikaze. Over 100 sailors died on board it, which is actually fairly low considering the amount of damage. Now, the Southern Force, Admiral Nishimura, with 2 battleships, enters the narrow Surigao Strait, and this will become known as the Battle of Surigao Strait. And he runs into a trap by a force of 6 U.S. battleships. Now, this is very unique because the battleships were mostly survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack, the USS Maryland, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. All of them had been Pearl Harbor on December 7th and had been damaged, had been raised, repaired, and were now back in the war. Now, both Japanese battleships are sunk, and along with every other ship in the fleet except 1 cruiser, and Admiral Nishimura was also killed in the attack. This is the last battle in naval history to take place solely between all-gun warships. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was basically the end of Japanese naval power. Now, in April of 1945, the Japanese will launch a last-ditch suicide attack with their last ships, including the Yamato. The idea is they're going to just sail, beach themselves, and then just use their guns to keep firing at the American forces on the beaches. Unfortunately for the Japanese, and luckily for the Americans, the Yamato was sunk in an attempt to beach itself. Here we see it exploding. 3,055 of her 3,332 crew died on the Yamato. Now, despite the losses by their navy, Japan held out on Leyte for 67 days. 70,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, 15,500 Americans died. On January of 1945, the U.S. invaded the island of Luzon. Japan sent 150 kamikaze planes to attack the invasion fleet, and they end up sinking 17 U.S. ships. After a month, the Americans reached the outskirts of Manila. They do capture it after a month of house-to-house fighting. The fighting will actually continue on Luzon until August, right before the end of the war. 10,300 U.S. are killed, and another 36,550 are wounded in the Philippines. Now, the last part of today's activity is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, as you see a photograph here, is a small flat island. It's only 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, and has one single mountain at one end. Here we see Mount Suribachi. Now, the Americans are going to invade. You're going to see the pictures. I'll just show you. This beach over here, that's going to be the invasion beach. The Americans are going to come in from that side, right next to Mount Suribachi. There we go. It's only 670 miles from Tokyo, so it'll have closer airfields. Here we see on the map. And you can see we're getting very close to Japan now. Now, Japan expected it to be attacked and prepared for it. They had built about 11 miles of tunnels around Mount Suribachi. The Japanese have 22,000 men led by a General Kuribayashi. Did I say that right? Kuribayashi. They're dug in these tunnels. Now, Kuribayashi is, he doesn't believe in the suicidal banzai charges. He feels they're a waste of manpower. What he wants to do is make Iwo Jima a slow war of attrition. Wear down the American forces, kill as many Americans as you can without wasting as many of your lives. So that's why there'll be no banzai charges. After the battle, his body was never even recovered. Now, by now, there are no ships or planes to help in the defense of Iwo Jima. The soldiers on the island are on their own. Now, February 19th, 1945, 3 U.S. Marine divisions, 30,000 men, land on the beaches. Here you can see them heading shore. You can see Mount Suribachi in the distance. It's very volcanic. Mount Suribachi was a volcanic island. So the ground is very difficult. It's very hard to dig into it. So they aren't able to dig foxholes for themselves. So the Marines are pretty much caught in the open. And you can see up in the upper right-hand corner of that photograph, Mount Suribachi, the Japanese can just fire down upon them. Now, obviously, Mount Suribachi had to be captured. So slowly the Marines fight their way up the island, up the mountain. It would take 4 days before they would capture it. Now, on February 23rd, the summit was reached. And this is when we see the famous, you saw this in the video yesterday, the raising the flag on Iwo Jima. This was the second time they did it. They were recreating the first one. This was the one where Joe Rosenthal took the photograph, the famous photograph of, and this was in all the newspapers and magazines. It took 25 days to capture the island. They had to bring in flamethrowers to burn the Japanese out of their holes and tunnels. They even had tanks, Sherman tanks, that didn't fire shells, that were actually rigged up to become flamethrowers. You saw that in the video yesterday. Now, most of the Japanese soldiers on the island fought to the death. Of all the soldiers on the island, only 216 gave up. "7,000 U.S. Marines were killed in Iwo Jima. The Marines received 27 Medal of Honor awards. That was a quarter for all the Marines in the entire war. They received Medal of Honors. 27 were on Iwo Jima. Now, the United States Marine Corps War Memorial outside Washington, D.C. memorializes all U.S. Marines with a statue of the famous picture, raising the flag. Nearby is the U.S. Marine Museum. You can see the architecture of the museum. It kind of reflects the raising of the flag. If you go in the museum, I got a picture. This is the actual flag that was raised over Iwo Jima. Even in the gift shop, they have a Lego statue of raising the flag at Iwo Jima. Now, Iwo Jima, now that's in control of the United States, they built new air bases there, and they were helping with their B-29 bombing missions over Japan. You saw that in the video yesterday. They didn't really launch from Iwo Jima, but basically it was an emergency landing field if planes were damaged. You saw that in the video yesterday. Okay, well, that completes today's activity. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. And I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.